Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Vitality Secret podcast. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be interviewing Andrea Harrison, who is a clinical counselor who specializes in depression, anxiety, and trauma. And this is a huge subject right now for reasons you're about to find out. When I first started off in this space 5 or 6 years ago, it was really about how nutrition was one of the main focal points to reverse many, many illnesses. And in the last couple of years, I've dived deep into the mind-body connection to discover that trauma might just be the underlying factor behind what creates inflammation in the body, or rather what sets the scene for inflammation to develop in the body. So Andrea and I met during this book launch for a book called Ignite Your Health and Wellness. And as you can see, that's the name of the book. And we got talking on her subject because I found her fascinating. Oh, you have company.
Sorry.
So I found the conversation with Andrea fascinating. So without further ado, welcome, Andrea. Thank you for coming on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I loved our conversations, and I felt I could have talked to you for quite some time. I'm really excited to share with the audience your approach, your practices. How do you get people to release it? But before I do that, I'd just like to ask you a little bit about your story. How did you get into this? With most people in the holistic space, most people have some kind of background, their own personal story, or someone that they've been involved with who has suffered in a certain way. What's your story? How did you get into this?
So counseling in general, it was always just where I was meant to go. I do believe that counselors, or good counselors, we are born, not studied. So, of course, you have to do both. But so for me, when I started counseling, I was really struggling with the fact that I'd have clients that had been through immense trauma, and although they would get better for a period of time, it just kept coming back. And it was frustrating for me as a practitioner, because my number one goal was to help them to get better and to stay better. And so I started to really look into what was missing in my field, because it wasn't only my story. I was working within all the modalities that can be really helpful and still really help people. I still work in some of those modalities, but the trauma piece was still pretty unknown. And I hadn't really met anybody that was able to really clear a client from trauma. They could feel better, they can continue on with life, but some of the major traumas were just still showing up constantly. So in that, once I started looking into it, I started to discover what one of my therapies, this is more of a somatic type therapy called mind-body attunement therapy. And I just lucked out. We had a local brilliant psychologist here who wanted to train a small group of counselors in this modality to help clients actually get rid of the trauma. So in that, it was very neurobiology, scientific-based approach, with an understanding that trauma actually sits in the cells in our body. And until we get in there and we release that trauma, there's dysregulation in the system continually, which shows up in all different ways. And physically is something that we see often. There's a lot of physical illness in clients that I've seen that experience trauma, which was also my own story. I had some trauma in my past, especially as a child, and I have had chronic illness for years and years. And so when I started to look into this and I decided to train with the therapist, the psychologist, it was just really life-changing for me and started to become life-changing in the next few years that followed, and still continues to be for my clients. Part of the training meant that I had to be extremely regulated, and I can't practice trauma therapy unless my system is extremely regulated, and I wasn't. Most of us aren't. Most of us, probably 90% of us, live day to day in dysregulation. whether we've had major trauma or not. And so I in order to do this, I had to go through a large number of sessions myself as the client, to make sure that my system was regulated and that I was able to expel the trauma. And it worked. And it was the first thing that I saw worked. And it made me really excited because I knew this was it. This was going to help a lot of people.
Incredible. So how could you tell that it had worked?
Well, lots of memories that I carried, old negative patterns in life and relationships started to leave, but I also started to understand why they were still there. And so the more I studied and the more I watched and the more I experienced myself, I could see how the link that everyone had talked about is real. It was sitting in the cells of my body. And so during each session, I would have to go get brought to a place of dysregulation and then regulated and dysregulated again until the trauma would come out in all different ways. It was really quite cool. Some people yawn, some people cry, some people laugh hysterically, but it really is your body getting rid of that negative energy that's still sitting there from trauma.
That's incredible.
So, yeah, just experience it myself, the freedom, the difference. We're so used to living in dysregulation. Once you feel what actual
balance feels
like in your system, it's just incredible. And I
Amazing.
see it so quickly in my clients. They can sit down and I'm like, okay, you're very dysregulated. We need to work on this, because it just shows up in all areas.
Fascinating. Can you hold 1 second? I'm being blinded by
you are being blinded.
I wish there were some warnings about that. Never known the sun come down like that.
Who would know? Who would know?
Who knew?
It's a mystery.
That's really fascinating about the idea of coming back into a place of balance and you actually seeing that with someone.
Yeah.
Because I see it as if we're a walking, talking, breathing human, we all carry trauma in us because we've all experienced something, normally many things. Obviously, some people way more severe than others. And yet it does affect all of us. Mm-hmm. So I've come to realize that this trauma gets stored like a trapped energy, doesn't it? It's kind of, have you heard of the emotion code?
Yep.
So is it fair, do you agree with the notion that it gets stored like electromagnetic bundles of energy and it can get stored throughout your whole body? I mean, you said it gets stored in the cell itself, didn't you?
Yeah.
So I understand it getting kind of stored throughout the body. It might be the organ. There's the notion that the organs weep the tears, the eyes never shed. And so it can get stored. So if we don't cry, we don't let it out of the body, it gets stored and it can create dis-ease. Or it can get kind of stored throughout the muscle fascia or psoas muscles, particularly top of our legs. And if we don't allow it to release, it can block the flow of electricity, which can drop the electrical flow to different organs in the body. And then we have compromised electricity. And then that's what actually leads to chronic illness. Mm-hmm. So it sounds very similar to what you're talking about, but you're going even deeper into the cell itself, aren't you?
Yeah.
So
let me give you an example. So one thing that I saw over and over again, if we're talking about kind of health, the health aspect of what trauma can do, it's very, very common when you have somebody who has a past where they've been sexually abused, sexually molested as a child. What we tend to see if it's a female is as they get older, even into early teens or when they hit puberty, their body and whatever's going in there, it's just compromised. Like we've said, that trauma's sitting in certain cells. So we see these women a lot of times, or even young girls, getting continued urinary tract bladder infections. So we see a lot of it in that area. So we're looking at any of the female reproductive areas. So a lot of times it sits in that area. I'm not saying anybody who has that, of course, has had that kind of trauma, but it's quite consistent that we see when there is some sort of sexual abuse that hasn't been let go and it's still sitting in the body. It's a lot more common for that to show up in health matters in the woman's reproductive area.
Wow.
So so you can see that link of what the body does and what it stores, because that's an unhealthy place in their mind, right? So that's a no-go place. That's an unhealthy place. That place has caused a lot of trauma and horrible bad memories. And so what the body does is it just continually makes it sick.
Incredible. Wow. Mm-hmm. And that can go for other things like endometriosis, I guess, as well.
Absolutely. And again, I'm not saying it's the only reason. There's obviously medical reasons as well, but it's just something that I've seen as a continued pattern.
Wow. Okay. How can you tell if something's stored with that precision around that kind of area?
Well, it's doing a full assessment, I guess, would be the first way, right? So I always do an assessment when clients come in where I really want to get to know them, and I just get really curious, and I ask both areas. So tell me about your physical health. How is that? What's going on with that? And, sometimes they'll, I have this, or I have this, or chronic pain I've had for years. We don't really know where it came from, or, you just see the unhealthiness overall, lots of pain, lots of back pain, neck pain, just stress areas, lots of stomach issues, tons of stomach issues. And of course, I'm not a doctor. I don't deal with those pieces. But then when I hear the stories and I look at areas of trauma that we may consider trauma, there's usually a real link to the health issues and when they started versus when memories came back, when trauma started, and or when they hit an age and stage where they start to look at past things that happened in the past. They start to look at that in a different way when they turn a different age or hit puberty or menopause or anything in regards to those areas.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned somatic therapy earlier.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm hearing now is it's useful to find out about a person's history, but you don't have to necessarily go into the history to let the trauma out. Because I see current talk therapy as being quite counterproductive in some areas, because in neuroscience there's the notion or the fact that nerve cells that fire together wire together. So the more and more we talk about an event, the more it gets strengthened and the more energy that goes to it, and the more it becomes more of an impact on the body in a negative way.
Yeah.
So that's kind of traditional talk therapy. So somatic is releasing, or can you, maybe it's best if I ask you this, what's the difference between, traditional talk therapy and somatic therapy?
Well, when I first started, the traditional talk therapy, there was this unfortunate belief that if people talked about things over and over and over and over again, eventually the trauma would go because they weren't thinking about it anymore. It wasn't in their system anymore. What we now know is the opposite. What happens in those situations when people have to continue to talk about it, or a therapist runs them through and they talk about a certain trauma over and over again, we just disassociate. So the brain disassociates from that trauma, which is even worse because now where do we place it if it's not in our mind? It's in our body.
Interesting.
So it just shifts. Wow. So it just shifts into the body, and that's where we see real sickness start to happen. I have clients come in, oh no, I've dealt with that. I've dealt with that trauma. I've seen counselors. Okay, well, tell me a little bit about that trauma. And the minute that they start talking about it, I can see the reactivity in the body. And right away, I'm like,
interesting.
It's still there. I'm sorry to tell you, but it's still there. You have disassociated from it, but your body is telling you something completely different.
And you just made me think of an example with a friend who died from cancer actually a few years ago. And she was talking to an energy healer, and the energy healer, who had these incredible gifts of, I guess we'd call them psychic gifts and clairvoyant gifts. She actually asked her a direct question: what happened at this time in this part of the world? And she actually said, that something pretty traumatic happened, but I've dealt with it. That's what she said. I've dealt with it. I've done lots of work on it. Mm-hmm. And the healer said, no, you haven't. It's still in your body. And she had these incredible gifts. I'm getting goosebumps as I'm talking about this. You just made me think of that with that very thing you just said. People think they're dealing with something because they've done all this talk therapy, but it's actually stored energetically in the body. Yeah. And that's what leads to dis-ease.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
and what we're doing with this therapy is once we're able to let go of it and we really get it to release out of the body, get that energy to release, the energy that really has been suppressed since a traumatic event happened, then our bodies are able, just as you talk about physically, our bodies are able to, at that point, it reactivates their natural healing system. And so then that allows the nervous system to heal and start to grow.
Love it. And then that can be circled back to what I was talking about earlier about how we store the trauma as trapped energy, like electromagnetic bundles of energy. And like I've even got the book here. It's The Emotion Code with Dr. Bradley Nelson. He talks about using magnets. I mean, it's mind-boggling to get your head around that. But I bring that up because we understand that once the trauma is released, it kickstarts the body back into action. It changes the flow of electricity, allows all the organs to start kind of firing again, much like a lighting circuit in a house. Is that fair to say? Would you agree with that?
I would say to a degree, definitely. If you think about it, if you're looking at it in an energetic way, how much energy is your brain itself subconsciously having to put towards suppressing trauma?
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Massive amounts of energy just to suppress that. So people are able to live their day-to-day lives without being completely reactive all the time. And even that, the reactivity comes up, and depending on which way that shows, people are having to continually stuff that down day to day. So the energy to do those two things, how does your body have energy to heal? How does your body have energy to do anything else? This is where we see chronic fatigue, lots of chronic pain versus fatigue. Sickness really is what it is, because your body is working so hard to suppress that, and not enough energy goes to what it's supposed to do. And that's why once we are able to release that body, that natural healing system can finally start to do what it's meant to do.
Amazing. So this is obviously very applicable to people with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, when that gets stored in the body.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. So can you talk us through one of the modalities that you use to release the trauma on a somatic level?
Yep. So one of the therapies I do is called mind-body attunement therapy. In that therapy, what we have to do is we don't necessarily talk about a situation, but we ask questions kind of around it, because again, we don't want to re-traumatize. So it may be something like, okay, Neil, tell me how old you were at the time of this trauma. That's all it would take. And you may say, I was 5. And then I would say to you, okay, so what are you noticing physically right now? And so that's when you start to notice what's your body's going through. This is when clients are really surprised, because they're like, well, all of a sudden I'm tense, I feel sweaty, I can't breathe, as well. I can feel all the things that the body's going through. And so we get the client there, then we bring them back down where we get them regulated again. And when we bring down that regulation in a specific way, and it would be lengthy for me to do that, but we bring the body and the system down again. And then when we do that, it allows the body to kind of start releasing some of that trauma in all different ways. And it is energy. I've done it where I could feel energy in my feet, just like tingles. And then it's just watching where that goes. And then we run them through that over and over again, really lightly and really slowly. And so when they get to a place where they're really ready to release that trauma, as we take them through the process, that's when we see really great things. We see, like I said, some people, I laugh hysterically sometimes, and it's just laughing to tears, and that's my body's way of getting rid of it. Yawning is extremely common. It's the body's just yawning and just trying to get rid of it. Crying, lots of tears, lots of crying. Everybody just does it in a little bit of a different way that relates to them. And at the end, you just make sure they're super regulated. And you do that practice with clients over and over again without really even talking about the main issue. I just lost, yeah, there you are. Without really even talking about the actual trauma itself, just some light questions around it.
Incredible.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a lot of breath work myself, and I understand the power of breath work in releasing trauma. And my body shakes a lot, much like it does in trauma release exercises.
Yeah.
For those people not aware of trauma release, it's a form of release when you tire out the muscles in the legs. Well, if you do the trauma release exercises, and they shake kind of involuntarily is the word I'm looking for. So they start to shake. And I first had this done by an energy healer a couple of years ago, and then a friend of mine who reversed her chronic pain shared with me how this has been a method for her to release the trauma from the body. So I've understood how my legs can shake a lot and my whole body shakes. With breath work, my whole body shakes. With plant medicine, with ayahuasca, my whole body shakes for hours and hours, as if, releasing all this trauma, and it feels incredibly cleansing. So it feels like a very similar kind of approach. It's just the body finding like an exhaust, like a way of letting it out of the system.
Yeah.
And there's a number of different modalities, aren't there now?
Yep,
and
there are, thankfully. Yeah.
Thankfully, yeah. And we don't have to go and relive all of these things, because I find that quite unhelpful.
It is. And one other thing I want to mention is you mentioned PTSD earlier, being something this would be effective for. But one thing that I think people need to understand is trauma is different for everybody. So what I may have found traumatic, you may not. So although this helps with obvious trauma, as when we're looking at abuse or neglect or PTSD type symptoms, we look at that as someone in a horrible accident or somebody, in the army that's seeing things that really, really affects them. But trauma can look like anything.
It could be an argument.
It could be.
It could be, with someone you care about, family member or even a friend.
Absolutely. And to some people would come in and say to me, oh my gosh, this has been horrible. And let me know what's going on. And they do. And to me, because I know how trauma does look different for everyone, I will say, okay, that sounds like it was a really big deal for you. Where someone else might see that and think, what's traumatic about that?
Yeah.
And so we have this, there is this judgment of what should be considered trauma and what isn't. Well, that's not traumatic. Come on, suck it up. So I'm always really careful with that, because I have a lot of clients who come in and say, well, I don't really think it's trauma, but this happened and it was really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really brilliant point you made, because, it goes back to what I said earlier about us being a walking, talking, breathing human. We've all been subjected to some kind of trauma to a degree. So they could be little traumas, big traumas, but ultimately something has happened and we get to find ways to release it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I love the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Have you had some pretty amazing, or have your clients had some pretty amazing results then?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Across the board. Yeah.
And the best part of it though is so have I. Brilliant. And I wouldn't have pushed so hard to learn more about this therapy and worked so hard on it if I hadn't had the experience of what it is like to have a regulated system. Because it really is so different. It's, you're not sitting ready to go all the time. It's just a calmness. And I'm so thankful for it. And that really, really makes me want to help more people, because I can feel the benefits and how massive they are.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what is good for you? What is I guess any symptom, isn't it? Chronic stress or anxiety, or I often think of people who are highly strung, who react like this, very short fuse.
Yeah.
those are all symptomatic of trauma that has not been released from the body. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I like to say often when I see dysregulation, it's when someone's sitting really dysregulated. There's all different levels. When someone's sitting in that constant state, ready to go into fight, flight, or freeze. You know, so they get angry really quickly, or they freeze and they back out of something, or, you know, it varies for everybody. Males, just, you know, how they are genetically, tend to a lot more often go to the fight response, where they have a quick fuse, no patience, they, you know, and they're ready to go. Females, of course, can have that as well, but they tend to be a little more in the flight or freeze, where I can't have this argument, I'm out, you know. And so everybody's different, but those are just things we see genetically where I could really pull apart that piece. But yes, it's that reactivity all the time, that feeling of, okay, it's not good. Something's not good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think we've all experienced that to a certain degree. I have, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Andrea, we're coming up to 30 minutes now. So I'd love to, I know your time is valuable. I mean, you have a very short period of time in which we could talk. What's your number one advice? Actually, before I say that, I just want to say thank you again for your contribution today. It's been very, very valuable. And I think a lot of people are going to be able to relate to this. What is your number one vitality secret?
Really, it is deal with your mental health. You know, see the right people, get rid of past patterns, because if you can do all the things in physical health, but if you're not dealing with your mental health at the same time, you're going to continue to end up not feeling well, sick, unable to shed weight, you know, so take care of both. There needs to be a combination. It's not one or the other. You need to take care of all parts of you, physical and mental health. And if you can get that combination where you're working and putting the right work into both of them, then you're laughing.
I love that. And just reflecting on that, as I said at the beginning of the call, we are often so focused on what we're eating and how and exercise. And I used to be all about nutrition a number of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. I was all about nutrition because a number of people have got amazing results by switching to an anti-inflammatory life. They just take out the toxins, consume fuel, and then you're feeling better again. However, I now understand that we could be eating the best food nature provides, anti-inflammatory everything, and moving our bodies every day. But if we're not dealing with the underlying trauma and releasing that from the body, you could be vegetable juicing until the cows come home, but it's always going to continue to come back until you deal with the underlying trauma.
Absolutely.
So I just thought I'd say that and add it to what you just said, because I thought that was such a valuable point.
Yeah, it's mind and body, right? It's a combination of the two.
Yes. Yeah. And it used to be such a kind of a woo-woo kind of phrase, that mind-body, but science is catching up with all of this stuff now. And stuff like heart-brain harmony, you know, creating this harmony between the head brain and the heart brain is a phenomenally powerful tool for this.
Absolutely.
There's lots proven scientifically as well. So, yeah, thank you. I love what you're doing in the world. I love the contribution you're making. The lives are changing, and being a walking, talking, breathing example of it as well. I love that. So thank you for sharing. Where can people find you if they would like your support?
Well, I do online, so people can find me it's just by email right now for clinical work, trauma work, which is at Andrea Harrison. I'm just trying to think of a better way though. So my website is just up and coming for ICU Mamas. Which is where I'm helping and supporting women and moms. And that probably is actually the best place to find me, even if you're not a mom, even if that's what you want to look. There'll be a section on there just for clinical work. So I would say icumamas.com would be the place to find me.
And that's the full version of the words.
Yeah,
ISEE.
Yeah, ICUYOUMAMAS. So ICU Mamas. Or buy the book, Ignite Your Health and Wellness, and it's all in there.
Yes, you can read both of our stories in
exactly. That. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrea. That's been really amazing. Really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. I'd be happy to come back and chat anytime.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Vitality Secret podcast. If you like this, please leave a 5-star rating. And if you loved it, please take a few minutes to leave a review. The more ratings and reviews that are left, the easier it is for this life-changing information to get into the hands of people who need it. Don't forget to join my free 7-day program and ignite your inner healer at vitalitysecret.com.